So hello and welcome to today's CPD session related to avoiding assessment irregularities and malpractice. This session is aimed at teachers and assessors of the Education and Childcare T level and will be exploring the subject in relation to assessment of the core elements and occupational specialisms. If you haven't already done so, please put something in the chat box to let us know you can hear us okay. You'll find it at the bottom of the webinar control panel at the right-hand side of your screen. Also, this session is being recorded and it will be shared on our YouTube channel afterwards. As per normal for all of our sessions, we encourage input and questions from participants. So please add your ideas and questions into the chat box as we progress. My name's Helen Scanlon and I'll be facilitating today's session. I'm one of NCFE's curriculum officers and I'm responsible for supporting the teaching and learning of the Education and Childcare T level. We're joined today by Janet King, the Sector Manager for Education and Childcare. And Janet will be able to answer any subject-specific questions. Hello, Janet, and thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Helen. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to the event. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks a lot. So we're going to be completing a range of activities, including a quiz, going to share ideas in the chat box and some small group discussions. Everyone's on mute for the moment, but when we move into the discussion, we'll be asking you to turn your microphones off. So you'll see the objectives for today's session on the screen now. The session will focus on ensuring quality and compliance in normal everyday circumstances, business as usual. As the assessment activities for this academic year are going to be different to normal, we will briefly cover the tag situation, but we'll also take into consideration how the core exams and employer set project would normally take place. This will support you and your students for resits and for future years when things get back to normal and back to business as usual. If you've got any specific tag questions, please do include them in the chat box, and if we're able to answer them, we will. We'll spend some time exploring the assessment requirements for the occupational specialisms and signpost you to the specific tag guidance and support. Okay, we're going to start off today's session with a quiz. The purpose of this first activity is to clarify some of the terminology we're going to be using and start to explore what malpractice is. I'm going to launch the quiz now. The questions are a mixture of multiple choice and true or false. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to complete this quiz and then we'll run through the answers. Don't worry too much about getting the answers right. They are intended to get you thinking about today's session topic, just as any starter activity in a classroom situation or a learning situation would do. Thanks for those who've completed the quiz so far. Just give you a bit longer to get through. I think there's 12 questions in total, and then we'll run through all the answers. Okay, we have some submitted answers now. As I say, we're just going to give you a little while longer to get the rest of those answers in. Right, I'm going to close this shortly. So if you could get your answers in, just whiz through the rest of them and we'll have a chat about the answers. Okay, thanks everybody. So I've got the first 6 questions on the screen now. I'm going to run through the answers. Please make a note of any that you need to. So for question 1, it's the Joint Council for Qualifications. You'll find their Policies and Procedures document in the Resources section of today's webinar. This document clarifies terminology, explains how the regulations impact on assessment practice, and the responsibilities of everyone involved in assessment of our qualifications. You'll find that the NCFE cash documents, the assessment regulations and policies, make many references to this document. For question 2, it's the Policies and Documents section, so please have a look there on QualHub if you haven't already yet. For question 3, the QSID, and it lives in the Policies and Documents section, same one as for question 2. The seating plan can also be found as an appendix of the regulations, which leads us to question 5, and it's at least 1.25 metres. For question 6, it's all of the assessment types mentioned, but there are more that I didn't include. So for question 7, it's a secure room. It is important for the relevant staff members to know the difference between the stated rooms to ensure compliance. And question 8, as for question 7, the relevant staff must only open the question papers in that secure room. For question 9, this was a bit of a trick question, as the clock could be analogue or digital, but it's important to note here that the clock or clocks must be clearly visible to all of the candidates. For question 10, the role of the invigilator is really important, and to be compliant, centres must ensure that they are fully trained for their role and aware of the policies and procedures that they must adhere to, and also what they must do and record. For question 11, it's up to you guys if a late arrival can enter the room and complete the assessment, but if you do allow them to do so, they must still be given the full time allowed. So for example, if the exam was due to start at 9 AM and they arrived at 10 AM, if you allow them into the room, you've still got to give them the full time of the test. So if that was a 2-hour test and they don't arrive till 10, they've got till 12 to complete it. And finally, for question 12, it's all of the examples, but the list is expanded on in the policy and procedure document. So thanks so much for completing that. When it comes to ensuring assessment compliance and avoiding malpractice, the words and terms used can appear to be quite scary, but with accurate information and guidance, we should be confident that our practice is good. It's at this point I'd therefore like to reassure you and tell you not to panic. The information and guidance we're going to signpost you today should ensure your centre compliance. If staff follow the procedures and policies set out in the JCQ policies and procedures and the NCFE assessment regulations documents, then malpractice and irregularities can be avoided. Okay, this next slide shows you where you would find the NCFE documents on QualHub. As you can see, there is a section for the mandatory policies and fees, the regulations for both internal and external assessments, and support guides. If you're in any doubt in relation to a specific area of assessment, you'll find the detail you need in this section. The regulations you'll find most relevant are the qualification-specific instructions, that's the QSID, the regulations for the conduct of external assessment, and the NCFE cash external assessment contingency planning document, and the NCFE regulations annex. The latter document should be read in conjunction with our regulations for the conduct of external assessment. It offers guidance on completing external assessments during the COVID-19 pandemic specifically. These are very important when conducting assessments in normal times, for example, non-pandemic, but are also applicable in the current teacher assessed grades situation to help you to evaluate the evidence you currently have, and we'll talk about this in more detail later. Okay, then let's start looking at the terminology in more detail, and the question here relates to malpractice. What does it mean to you? Please put your idea into the chat box to get us started, and I'll give you a minute or two to consider the meaning in relation to assessment, and you may need to make reference to assessment activities to help you to define it. So if you just pop in the chat box what you think, what you feel, what it means to you, the word malpractice. So in relation to assessment, what does the word malpractice mean to you? Oh, good, we've got some ideas coming in. So breaking the regulations for conducting the assessment, absolutely. Any detail you could provide in addition to that? What kind of breaking regulations would that mean? Okay, we've got some interesting points coming in now. Not being fair is coming in there, and also damaging the credibility of the qualification and of the awarding organisation. So excellent, thanks for that. Okay, I'm going to go and run through some examples. So from the JCQ, malpractice means any act, default or practice from a member of centre staff which breaches the regulations, which disadvantage or causes prejudice to candidates, compromises or negatively affects confidence in the qualification, impacts negatively on the integrity of a qualification or the validity of a result of a certificate, or damages the reputation or credibility of the awarding organisation or their staff. So a couple of words I'd like to pick up on here for you to explore in more detail would be prejudice. And looking at a generic definition, it would mean harm or injury that results in or may result from some action or judgment, or to make biased. In terms of assessment, this would relate to making the assessment outcomes unfair. And compromise, having a harmful effect on something, or the standards or morals to be lower. Again, in terms of assessment, we must ensure that standards are maintained and that confidence in the qualifications is safeguarded. Okay, I'd like to ask again for your input to get us started. Please provide some examples of malpractice in the chat box. I will pause a minute again just to allow you some thinking time. So what would be an example of malpractice? So we've got some ideas coming in, supporting students more or less and not fairly. Yes, seeing the exam papers ahead of the exam publication or a set time, absolutely. And there's also, people have brought in points related to assessment investigation if there's been suspected cheating. So that would be something, yeah. And then providing, yes, thank you for that idea, providing resources to offer some students support that's not allowed, not stated in the guidance. So lovely, thank you for that. You've identified some of the examples we've drawn from the JCQ document, which can be found in Appendix 2 of the document available in the materials section of this webinar. They're separated into centre staff and candidates. So I'm going to just provide a brief summary from the JCQ examples. So for centre staff, the first one will be breaches of security, and this includes storage of materials, discussing exam content, supervision of the candidates, providing access to assessment materials, as one of the participants have said, and tampering with the materials. The second one is deception, and this is acts relating to the invention or changing of marks, manufacturing evidence, fabricating records, entering fictitious candidates and providing misleading or accurate information to an awarding body, candidates or parents. Improper assistance to the candidates is something that's already been brought up. For example, providing help or guidance beyond what is permitted by the regulations, sharing candidates' work, allowing the use of prohibited materials, providing prompts in the production of assessment evidence or completion of exams, including verbal, non-verbal or written form. So failure to cooperate with an investigation was brought up by somebody, meaning not making available information requested or failing to investigate as requested, not meeting deadlines or reporting all alleged, suspected or actual incidents to the awarding body. And then there's also maladministration, and this general term refers to adherence to the regulations related to controlled assessments, and that also includes coursework, exams, and non-exam assessment, and also malpractice related to the conduct of assessments, including handling of examination papers, candidate scripts and answers, results and claim forms, etc. So more detail regarding those examples, as I said, is in Appendix 2 of the JCQ document. So moving on to the candidates, and this summary is an overview of much more detail from the same document that I've been referring to today. So for documentation, the alteration or falsification of assessment documents, including certificates, instructions and conditions, and this would include failing to comply with instructions or set conditions, or failing to comply with set conditions related to security. For collusion and copying, pretty much as you'd expect, working collaboratively beyond what is permitted, copying or allowing own work to be copied, and plagiarism is also included here. For behavioural malpractice, this would mean being disruptive during an assessment session, exchanging or obtaining or receiving information, and that's again in any form, verbal, non-verbal, written or electronic, or facilitating malpractice of other candidates. And then finally, communication. And this would include making false declarations, impersonations, and also including the use of offensive materials in their assessment evidence. So that would be if you're collecting portfolio evidence and you had anything that was offensive. So there's lots of different ways that malpractice and maladministration could take place if you weren't aware of the regulations. Okay, so we're now going to move on to signposting you to the relevant sections of the QSID which relate to the T-level education and childcare components. You'll see on the screen now the section related to the core component assessments. In normal times, there will be set assessment dates and times for the exams and a window for the ESP or Employer Set project. The assessment conditions are identified and differ for the different components. Students are not permitted to use the intranet or internet, but will require a computer for the online version of the exams. For the occupational specialisms, you can see that for early years educator, the date and time requirements and the assessment conditions, and for these, no computer use is permitted or required. The arrangements, external or controlled, are also identified here. And there's also detailed information regarding the arrangements for the paper-based assessments. All relevant staff should be aware of these. The next page completes the requirements for the early years educator with the arrangements for paper-based assessments, the windows, dates and conditions, and computer use. You'll also see the assisting teaching specialism also starts here. It's important to note the differences here in relation to the external or controlled assessment requirements for the different assignments. And then this also continues and concludes on page 41 of the document of QSID. If you have any questions, as just a quick reminder, please pop them into the chat box as we continue. So in the QSID, continuing on page 41, you'll find useful additional information. And this is split into core exams and the Employer Set project. I'm going to leave this slide on view just for a minute to allow you to read through it and formulate any more questions for us, which, as I said, we'd like you to put them into the chat box, please. Okay, so the final page related to the T-level is on the screen now. You can see here the requirements for the occupational specialisms. This includes detail regarding choosing the specialism, assignments and resets. And finally, the dates for registration are also summarised here too. We would strongly recommend accessing this document on QualHub when you need it. This is why it's not in the materials section of today's webinar. This way you can ensure that you've got the most up-to-date information. Saving local copies of the document will be useful, but please ensure you check that you're using the most recent version of the document at all times. Okay, so we're now going to look at this year's summer assessments and the requirements for tags. Firstly, each centre is being asked to produce a centre teacher assessed grading strategy. This will set out the roles and responsibilities for staff, what internal training staff will undertake, confirmation that staff will follow NCFE's guidance for producing the tags, what assessment materials will be used and how the information will be collated, the centre's process for producing the tags, the internal quality assurance processes planned, any special arrangements or considerations, how objectivity and fairness will be ensured, and lastly, how evidence will be used to create tags and how it will be stored and authenticated. Related to this session, an important section relates to the confidentiality and assessment practice. Centres must ensure that tags will not be disclosed until they have been confirmed by NCFE, that the tag strategy covers compliance and allegations of conflicts of interests, and there are also external quality assurance requirements and the inclusion of an appeals policy. Starting your tag process can happen as soon as you and your students are ready, but grades cannot be submitted until NCFE have approved your centre tag strategy. It might be useful to be involved in contributing to the production of this so that you're aware of your own responsibilities. So we'll now run through a brief summary of the tag process for T-levels with NCFE. The NCFE website is your go-to place for the most up-to-date information, and also for quality assurance, your next port of call would be your centre EQA. The first and most relevant point from us in the curriculum team is that you continue to teach the core components for as long as possible. As the exam dates were planned for June, it would be reasonable for you to have planned your delivery of the core components of the TQ up until then. Once you've finished the core teaching, you'll need to start collecting and examining the evidence of your students' knowledge, skills and understanding of all the core elements. The examination of this evidence should also take into account how it was produced. Was it in a classroom setting, a piece of homework, or independent study, or in some kind of controlled conditions? Consider how representative each piece of evidence is of each individual student's level of understanding, etc. Once you know what evidence you have for each student, you'll need to identify any gaps in relation to the core element criteria. You'll then need to identify the best way to assess any missing criteria. NCFE are producing a range of resources to help you to do this. For example, topic tests and more sample assessments, which you could use to ensure full coverage of all the areas which have been taught. If you're designing your own assessment activity, you'll need to ensure that the method can accurately measure the student's knowledge and understanding. For example, consider element 2, component 2.3. When the student must understand the key concepts underpinning a range of theoretical approaches, the strengths and criticisms of each approach, and how they complement each other to inform practice, how might you assess this at level 3? Might you ask the student to deliver a presentation, review a case study of a child, or write an essay on the topic? What is going to be the best way to ensure sufficient coverage whilst making the process manageable for everybody? The assigning of grades would then take place. This is something staff should discuss with their internal quality teams, and further guidance and training for this is going to be available in the coming weeks from NCFE's quality team. For overall guidance, please ensure that your students' evidence is valid, authentic, current, sufficient and reliable, and that you have a strong enough evidence base on which you can make your grading decisions. Janet, that was quite a lot of information. Do you think I've missed anything, or is there anything else you would like to add?
I think you've got the main points covered there, really, Helen. And I think the reassurance of this is a lot of information, and it is, you know, there's no two ways about it. It's a complicated and challenging time. So please do seek advice from your insurer where you need that. And remember that if you're using, you know, ESPs Okay, they uptick and they're going to cover a lot of information, and then you'll be able to address any gaps in the specifications and so on. So have a look, think about it, stay calm, and any questions go to your EQA. Thanks, Helen.
I'm joined by Jackie. Jackie, you're the Chief Moderator, is that the right title?
That's my correct title. So I'm the Chief Moderator for the T-level provision.
Brilliant. So Jackie and I have come up with some what we think are frequently asked questions, and we're going to discuss them for you now and run through them. So Jackie, I'm thinking for the occupational specialism, when does the moderation take place for that?
Okay, thanks. So yeah, there's been a lot of questions around the moderation, particularly during this time. So the moderation window continues to be as is advertised, and that will be from September 21 to the end of February 2022 for Early Years Educator Part 1. And for Early Years Educator Part 2 and the Assisting Teaching, the moderation of structured observations will be from February through to the end of April, and then final moderation, which takes place remotely, will be between May and June 22. We appreciate entirely that, especially for this first cohort, there's likely to be an overlap of the moderation activity for Part 1 and Part 2. And also just to reassure that we fully anticipate that due to the current situation, providers are more likely to want us to plan the visits towards the end of the moderation window, and we will work with you to support this wherever's possible. And the moderator is going to use the schedule of assessment that you supply to us to plan the visits, and we'll share a sample plan prior to the visit, just so that you know exactly which students we are hoping and planning to observe. And we will provide more guidance on how to complete the schedule of assessment. So please be reassured that we will provide you with some guidance for this. And we anticipate that you will start to provide us with this information from about August to September onwards.
Yeah, and it is reassuring for centres, isn't it, that you're saying you know that timelines are going to change. It's going to be guided by the employers that are hosting the placements for the observations. So a dialogue needs to happen between centres and you guys to make sure that it's manageable.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as I say as well, you know, it's likely that we will be continuing to observe Part 1 as we move into Part 2 as well, and just that reassurance that, you know, this first cohort, it is unusual circumstances, and we will be providing as much support as we possibly can.
Brilliant, lovely. I'm sure that'll be useful for everybody involved. So the next question we're talking about is what the moderator would expect to see during the centre visits.
So the key templates for use during the assessment of VYE Part 1 and Part 2 and the Assisting Teaching structured observations, they're all available on Qual Hub, and I really strongly recommend that you get as familiar as you possibly can with all of the templates, and there's some really clear guidance on there as to exactly what you should be including on each of the templates. The standardisation webinar that we completed recently, that also takes you through some useful points and is available for you to view on the NCFE website. But just to sort of remind you that the moderator will be able to give you some feedback following the moderation of Part 1. So it's really worthwhile sharing that discussion and having that opportunity for feedback with the moderator for Part 1. And really just to think of the activity or the observation or the assessment as a huge standardisation piece. So the moderator is going to want to see exactly how the assessor has reached their assessment decision. So they're going to want to see enough detail in the commentary to justify the observed activity and, crucially, the outcome of the assessment, and particularly when you get to marked structured assessments for part 2, they're really going to want to see how you have reached that decision. And forms should be signed and dated, just for added robustness. So yeah, I mean, the moderator will support you with that. And for part 2, again, going back to the detail that's captured, we want to see the actual observation being recorded, but crucially, the justification for the assessment decisions and the marks are the detail that we're going to be looking for.
Yeah, that word justification is really important, isn't it? Because the moderator's not at the observation necessarily, therefore the detail on the form needs to be sufficient to see why that grade, if you like, that grading decision is being made.
Absolutely, yeah. Justification, that is the crucial word, because you know, we will be sampling some of the observations, but when it comes to the final moderation, we may ask for a wider sample, and we are going to want to see that there is enough detail on there to justify the outcome of the assessment. That's why it's really crucially important that you join in with as much standardisation as possible, so that you can standardise each other's work. And really get familiar with the expectations of each of the grades for the structured observations.
Yeah, and I'm guessing the form doesn't need to be completed War and Peace, like, you know, it doesn't have to be massive, but if it's not recorded on the form, the moderator will not know that it had happened, or, you know, if something crucial happens. Yeah. Absolutely.
You know, that is a skill in itself, capturing the observation or the assessment in a succinct way. So, yeah, you know, to begin with, it's better to, you know, get as much detail on as possible before you sort of fine tune those finer skills of assessment writing. So, you know, we'd want to see more. It's better to always see more than not see enough.
Yeah, and it's about mapping the assessment decisions to the assessment outcomes, isn't it? It's being very clear of the link between what's being observed and what they're showing competence in.
Absolutely, absolutely. So for part 1, for example, you would want to show that the student has met the competency criteria, and that's a met or not yet achieved pass mark. And then for the structured observations, you would need to see that, you know, you've provided enough detail at the sufficient level for each of the grades that are being awarded, or the marks that are being awarded, should I say.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, and we went into more detail there, but that's really good. So next question, will the moderator need to observe all criteria for every student?
So, as I said, the moderator will select a sample of students to observe. They'll use the schedule of assessment to select that sample, and then the moderator will need to sign off the assessment for Early Years Educator Part 1. And the way that they'll do that is they will need to observe each of the criteria being accurately assessed. So they will observe each of the assessors. So they'll sample a range of students across each of the assessors that are assessing on the part 1. Yeah. And they'll just carry out the same observation and see that the assessor is making accurate assessment decisions against each of the criteria. So we won't need to see all of the criteria for all of the students that we sample. We just need to see that each of the assessors are making accurate assessment decisions, and it doesn't mean that the student they're achieving the criteria. It just means that the assessor is providing the accurate assessment decision and, you know, sufficient feedback, etc.
Yeah.
And then for the structured observations, the moderator again will select a sample of students to observe, and they'll observe alongside all the provider assessors. But in this instance, the moderator will need to observe a minimum of 40% of the planned criteria for each of the students that are being observed as part of the sample.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And just coming back to assessment malpractice, and one of the things that I'm guessing centres will need to be quite good on is if they've got more than one assessor, to ensure that they do some in-house standardisation as well.
Absolutely, standardisation is going to be absolutely critical for, you know, as it is for all qualifications, but especially, you know, this is a new qualification, so you'd expect that all your quality processes are going to reflect that you're going to have an increased opportunity for standardisation of practice, not only against the EYE competency criteria, but against the structured observation criteria and the expectations for the marks against each of the criteria. Because don't forget, each of the structured criteria have got their own allocated mark, and then that in turn provides a final mark for each of the structured observations. So yeah, you can't do too much standardisation for these.
Absolutely. Okay, lovely. Okay, is there anything in particular for the occupational specialisms that you would need to highlight as it could be malpractice? And we've talked about standardisation across assessors. Is there anything else?
Yeah, so I think when you're actually planning the observations or planning the assessments, it's really important that the students are encouraged to take the lead on the planning. You know, obviously that's a skill that will develop over time. But crucially, when you're actually completing the observation, you know, students, of course, will be encouraged to have discussions that are relevant to the observation or the activity that's taking place, that's being observed with colleagues within their setting. But we wouldn't expect there to be any prompting or any kind of support that's going to impact on the outcome of the assessment. So I think that's really important, that you get students prepared for that, so that they're aware that it's an actual assessment that's taking place, and that if there's any questions or anything that are asked during that, that can actually impact on the outcome of the assessment. So it's all about the planning and the preparation of it, and making sure that students have got sufficient opportunity to demonstrate their competency at that time. So it's important that you work with the setting as well, the industry placements, so that they are really aware of the assessment that's going to be taking place and the support that they need to put in place to allow that student to demonstrate what they've been able to learn throughout their course.
Excellent, really good point. Thank you for that. And are there any specific malpractice areas for the moderation of the assignments?
So again, with the moderation of the assignments, what will happen is this is particularly important for part 2. So the moderators will come and do an observation alongside the provider assessor. At that point, we won't share any marks with each other. So we'll just be observing the observation together, and the observation will be carried out alongside. But neither party will share any of the feedback or any of the marks that have been assigned or awarded following that observation. And it's only at the point of final moderation that the marks will be compared from the moderator and the provider assessor, and that will all be kept securely. So it's important that the provider assessors are prepared for that, really, that they won't get that feedback during that actual activity. It won't be until after the final moderation that they'll find out the outcome of that for that activity.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you for that. So you've mentioned some training already that there's been training taking place. Will there be more training sessions going forward?
Yes, so we aim to repeat all of the webinars and training that have been made available for Wave 1. Also, we've taken on board feedback from our Wave 1 providers, and please do share with us if there are any other training suggestions that you'd like us to deliver, particularly around assignment 2 and the moderation element. But we will be delivering some more standardisation training, just so that assessors are fully prepared for the assessment activity, and moderators will be contacting providers once they're allocated to you for next year, and they will be making sure, and we will be making sure as a team, that you feel as prepared as you possibly can be for that moderation element.
When will the external assessors be allocated?
So we're hoping that the moderators will be allocated in September, and they will be contacting you as soon as they're allocated. We don't want to do it too early because we completely appreciate that this is an unusual year, and that it may be that you're still making arrangements to place your students into placement. That being said, I would just like to say that if you are able to place your students this coming term into their placement, and you do want to start completing part 1 observations of your students, then you can do that as soon as you feel that your students are ready, and you can carry out as many observations as are needed for part 1. It's a competency based assessment, so you know, as soon as you feel ready and able to support your students to achieve that, then please do go ahead and start observing your students.
Yeah, and some students are already in placement, have been there a while, haven't they? So they might be
so
ready.
You might, absolutely.
Yeah, excellent, brilliant. So adaptations for the assignments. What can centres do?
Okay, so if you keep a check, obviously we know at the moment there's tags and there's adaptations happening for this year, and so it's really important that you keep in touch with what's going on with the comms that are sent out to providers regarding any updates. Please do regularly check the quality assurance policy that's been made available, but the most important piece of document that you need to look at is the addendum for each for the qualification. So in this case, looking at the adaptation addendum for the education and childcare T level, which will clearly outline any adjustments or adaptation to any assessment that's taking place. So it's really important that you have a look at that. But the main adaptation that happened was the reduction of the placement hours for this cohort. So as you fully appreciate, we still need to complete all the criteria for the competency based because it's licensed to practice. So it's just keeping a check on that addendum and checking against any plans you've got for your assessment to check that remains relevant and acceptable against the criteria.
Brilliant. So in anticipation of us going there, we have done a screenshot of where those vital pieces of information would be on QualHub. So on the screen now you can see adaptation section. Is this the section that keeps getting updated, Jackie?
Yes, this will be updated. If there's any updates, this is where you're going to find it.
Mm-hmm. So wonderful. Is there anything else at all that you'd like to highlight, ensure that everybody knows, or have we covered everything?
I don't think there's anything specific other than just keep looking at the guidance material and the support materials that are available. Access as much CPD and support that's being offered. You know, it's really going to prepare everyone really for the moderation activity that's going to be starting next year. And just remember that part 1 is very familiar to what you're used to anyway. It might be packaged slightly differently, but it's a very familiar assessment process. So once you start looking at that, you know, it really is a familiar method really of how you're observing your students currently for other EYE qualifications.
Yeah, and one thing I've been seeing at centres a lot is early years education hasn't changed. And nothing's new, if you like, just because T levels have come in. So existing good practice, and like you just said, it's this existing processes that you observe students, you know, in placement, etc. Use those as the basis to guide what they're doing for T levels.
Absolutely,
yeah. Excellent. Right, thank you so much for that, Jackie. Everybody knows where we are to ask questions, so I will encourage everyone to just keep in touch and to keep asking questions. And if I get any questions in today's session that I can't answer, I'm going to be passing them on to you and your lovely team, if that's okay.
Of course, a pleasure.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Jackie.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's lots more information related to moderation and assessment malpractice on QualHub, and you can, as I say, you can see it on the screen now. That would be your go-to place to get some more information, and the most up-to-date information will be there. Okay, lovely, thank you. So we've now got time to answer a couple of questions. One of the questions we've had is about resits and students being allowed to do a resit. Obviously, in every assessment window, we're going to have brand new live sample, brand new live materials. So somebody doing a resit in the autumn series, and even in the summer series of the second year from the core components is allowed. It's unlimited resits. The centre just needs to be aware that there's a cost. And also looking at the regulations, students can resit core components up to 2 years after they finish the programme as well. So obviously that would delay their progression onto either employment, higher education or an apprenticeship. But students have got the option to continue and resit after they've finished the programme. So that was just to confirm that. Janice, have you noticed any other questions?
One of the things that comes in on a regular basis is just looking at the early years educator and thinking about assignment 2. So assignment 2 in the early years educator pathway, as we know, has got 2 sort of elements to it, 2 parts to it. And people do wonder if they need to wait until the second year when the core has been completed before they can start using assignment 2 part 1. And that's just to reassure you that actually you can start assignment 2 part 1, the EYE competency criteria, as soon as your students start placement, and that's something that can really follow that student then throughout their journey in their early years placement. So just to make that clear.
Lovely. And someone's just popped into the chat box asking about how much feedback the assessor's allowed to give in that scenario.
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question. So if a student was doing that assignment 2 part 1 and they were in their early years placements, the assessor's going in, they've planned with them when they're going to go in, and they've got an idea of what they're looking for, they've had a discussion and planned that. Then what they'll be able to do, they'll be able to, in that assignment 2 part 1, they can give feedback. Sometimes that criteria will be met, sometimes the professional discussion will allow it to be met, sort of wrapping around the observation, and other times it might well be that things have to be carried over and given a little bit more thought, and the assessor can go as often as they want to with assignment 2 part 1. There is no restriction. It's if you've been teaching on the EYE qualifications and using the competency professional practice portfolios such as Unit 16 or the professional practice portfolio 1 and 2 from the diploma in childcare and education, then you'll be able to observe and meet those competencies in exactly the same way.
Lovely. And I've got another question about should they encourage students to keep some kind of diary or evidence of what they're doing at placement so they can use it to reflect back on or link to the core component learning? What's your thoughts on a portfolio or a learning diary?
I think it's a good idea, and I think students could use that to bring forward some ideas for their professional discussion. So they may well have been observed with something, and then they could refer to their diaries and their reflective work to be able to enhance that professional discussion following their observation. All students are different. Not all students will enjoy doing that. Some students might just want to sort of do highlights of the week or something like that. And I think it's about being student-centred, but it's certainly something that can be used to enhance those professional discussions, I think, part of that observation process.
Lovely, thank you. Any other questions that you have been asked that you could share, Janet?
Somebody asked the other day about confirming whether exams, the exam paper A and paper B needed to be, if there's a concern with that or the student needs to resit, then actually you do need to sit both parts of that paper. So it was just to confirm that really, and just to make sure that centres are referring to that through that document about those regulations and about the different components and how they sit and the regulations. So that's a really good go-to place.
Lovely, thank you. And as I say, just keep the questions coming, even if it's after the today's webinar, please send them to us. So it's now time for you to consider your own takeaways. Consider what you'll take away from today's session, but more importantly, how you're going to use it. The normal action planning, remembering that to make CPD meaningful, we should focus on how you'll action the learning from the webinar and how you'll use it to inform and develop your practice. And please try and set yourself 1 or 2 action points and deadlines which you can use to help you to continually develop your teaching and learning practice. So on the screen now, you'll see that we've got what we've got planned for the coming months. For our centres coming to the end of their first year of delivery, you can see what CPD is planned now. I'll remind you of these in your next curriculum consultations. For our September 21 starts, you can see the forthcoming onboarding sessions on the screen now. We'll offer further opportunities to attend the centre induction session during the summer. And also, if new members of staff have joined teams, they might find some of the Wave 2 sessions useful if you're a Wave 1 provider. They'll include some of the input from the sessions we've already delivered as CPD for Wave 1 providers. And also, of course, all of our webinars are recorded and made available to everyone after the event. So all we have to say now is to thank you all so much for attending and participating in the session today. Please take a minute to complete our evaluation as you log out. Your feedback and ideas help us to develop our CPD offer. And I've also included the links to the T-level support pages on this last slide. Janet, is there anything you'd like to mention or say that I might not have covered?
I don't think there's anything you haven't covered, Helen. So just to say thank you to everybody for taking part in the webinar, and hope to speak to everybody soon. Thanks, Helen.
Brilliant, thanks, Janet. So we'll say goodbye, and from everyone at NCFE Cash, please stay safe, and we look forward to working with you again in the future.